What's up, YouTube? Hey, it's Drew with Moto Adventure again. I had a comment the other day on one of the YouTube videos where somebody wanted to know what are the mods that I've done to the CRF250L since I've had it. So I figured I'd go ahead and shoot a video and talk about what I've done to the CRF250L over the last year, and then basically, after 8,000 miles on the odometer, what's it like living with the CRF250L? So I picked up the bike in October, and it had about 2,000 miles on it. The previous owner had already done some of the mods. So the first thing was that they put on the Two Brothers exhaust. They had the Zeta handguards on the bike already. This has the Seat Concepts comfort seat, which I'm a big fan of. I don't have the stock seat or the stock exhaust. I wish I had the stock seat so I could compare. I would probably race with the stock seat. That way I would be saving, the comfort seat for the long dual sport days. And I wish I had the stock exhaust, because there were times where I'd rather be quiet, because this Two Brothers sounds great, but it's loud. So if you're in the city doing things that are kind of a gray area, it's kind of hard to, sneak off in that situation. The previous owner also put the Pro Moto billet luggage rack on the back. That's been convenient, obviously, because I've commuted on the highway to work and whatnot, so I've had, the luggage or like a tail bag on the back. So I've been able to take my lunch and my work clothes to work with me. The previous owner had a second set of plastics, which I think are mostly the originals, and they put on the graphics. And that was kind of like a must-have for the sale. Like, once I saw the graphics kit on the bike, and considering that, Rosie is the Warthog, it was like, you got to buy this bike. First thing I did with the bike when I got it was I got the Go Cruise throttle lock. Next thing I did was I put a folding shift lever on. It was also October, so I put heated grips on the bike. Both of my bikes both have Oxford heaters. I was really happy with those on the Scrambler, and I knew I wanted to do some commuting to the office because I figured the dual sport bike would be easier to take care of in the winter. I also put the 2-inch rocks risers on here. When I first started riding on the street, I kind of felt like my hands were a little low, and I was having a hard time getting comfortable standing up because I felt like I was reaching down on here. I was headed to work, I think it was in February. Took a little spill on some black ice. I'll put a link in the description so you can read that full story. But ultimately, that bent the stock bars as the bike skid down the road a little bit. So I had to replace these bars with some 7/8 Pro Taper bars. Along with the handlebars, I cracked one of the mirrors, so I went ahead and bought the double take mirror kit. I went ahead and invested in the Flatland Racing skid plate, which also came in a package deal where you could get the radiator guard and the skid plate together. I also put on the Giant Loop exhaust shield because I wanted, and I ended up getting the Kriega backbone kit where it's just a flat strap, so I could put the OS18 bag on that backbone and then buy another OS18 bag to put on the other side, so that way I could live off the 250L for a week while I did the Kentucky Adventure Tour. And the last thing was to get ready to race the 250L. I went ahead and invested in a 42 tooth rear sprocket. So I want to talk about pros and cons of owning the CRF250L. Since this is a dual sport bike and obviously has to pull double duty as both a dirt bike and a street bike, it's only so good at both worlds. So first I'm going to talk about what are the pros for it being a street bike. So this bike, unlike the Triumphs that I've had, actually comes with a digital dash. It also comes with a digital fuel gauge. This bike comes with a helmet lock, and it also has a locking tool compartment. This bike also has some really long service intervals. I mean, with oil changes every 8,000 miles and valves every 16,000 miles, this thing is akin to my Triumph, if not longer. This bike gets great gas mileage. I mean, as long as you're commuting to work and you're just out taking the side roads, this thing really sips the gas at 55 miles an hour. This bike also has plush suspension. I mean, it's a dual sport. I mean, I love it when I'm commuting to the office. I mean, it just soaks up the bumps when you hit those expansion joints in the middle of the winter on those bridges and overpasses. I mean, it's no fuss, no muss. I mean, it's not afraid of potholes come spring. Just like I said about being a dual sport, I mean, it has a 21-inch front tire, so it has some really precise steering. I mean, that's take it or leave it for some people, but for me, I like the precision and the accuracy with the 21-inch front. This bike's also really forgiving. The stat sheet claims that this thing has like 22 horsepower, but I mean, most of the dyno runs say that it's more like 18. This is the kind of bike that I can hand the keys to anybody of any skill level and I don't have to worry about them getting in trouble. It's also got really linear power delivery. So this is a great bike that I can teach somebody new how to ride. So this bike is also a glutton for punishment. It's built to be like a dirt bike. So this is the kind of bike that a new rider, if they're gonna drop it in the parking lot, they're gonna, have a low end spill at a stop sign, it's a non-event. Because this bike's meant to be ridden off-road, again, it's built like a dirt bike, so it's easy to work on. Wheels are set up so that you can change tires quickly. You can do oil changes in a heartbeat. I can get an oil change done on this bike probably twice as fast as it takes me to do it on my Scrambler. Parts for this bike are also cheap. It cost me about $30 to do an oil change on this bike, and it's probably upwards of $75 or more for me to do a full synthetic oil change on my Scrambler. So let's talk about cons to the 250L being a street bike. Max speed of this bike is about 80 to 85 miles an hour. And at that point, you're pretty much approaching the red line of the engine. I'd like to tell you what RPM the engine's actually running at max speed, but this bike doesn't come with a tachometer. Now, for a 250 street bike, 80 miles an hour isn't bad. You can still commute to work. I can still ride this bike to Kentucky. I don't have a problem riding this bike on the highway for about an hour, from here to Cincinnati. But at that point, I would rather stick to the side roads. I'm just worried that it's not going to be good long term to run the engine that hard on the highway. Along with high revolutions on the highway, I do feel like the 250L could use just a little more oomph. The stat sheet claims that this bike has 22 horsepower, but all the dyno runs say that it's more like 18. That 18 horsepower off-road really isn't that big a deal, but when you're going to spend a lot of hours on the street, that's when you start to measure it up against other street bikes and you wish there was just a little more juice. This bike has a 2-gallon gas tank, which is completely normal in its class, and as long as you're doing the back roads and riding off-road, like I said, it sips the gas under 55. But if you're on a long stretch of 65, 70 mile an hour speeds, which I would normally do if I was doing back roads on my way to Kentucky, then you have to stop and get gas about every 100 miles. That's normally the point where I want to get off the bike anyway, but I admit that when I want to do those long adventure tours, that it could use an extra gallon of gas. So let's turn the tables and then talk about the dirt side. What are the pros to the 250L being a dirt bike? At about 34.5 inches, the 250L has a pretty low seat height when you look at it against comparable dirt bikes. Dirt bikes are usually 36 inches or more. Now, the other perk to the 250L is people think, well, 34 is still a really tall seat because I only have, whatever, inseam. I'm 5'10", I have a 32-inch inseam, and once I sit down on this bike and the suspension compresses, I can totally flat foot the bike, no issue. The 250L is also fuel injected. We live in a world today where a whole bunch of dirt bikes are still carbureted, and there's still quite a few carbureted dual sports on the market right now. Honda's own 650L still has a carburetor. And I mentioned earlier long service intervals. At 8,000 miles for an oil change, this is light years beyond dirt bikes. Most dirt bikes, you're changing oil almost every 8 hours. Now, that 8,000 mile service interval assumes that you're just commuting and you're trail riding on this bike. If you're gonna race this bike like you would a traditional dirt bike, all that goes out the window. For a dirt bike, I consider the 250L to be long distance comfortable. This is the kind of bike that I can do a 500 mile day. I can leave my driveway on the 250L, ride 4 hours to Kentucky, ride whatever trails I want off-road, and then ride the 4 hours home and still be ready to ride the next day. The 250L has a counterbalanced 4-stroke engine. You're gonna feel a lot less vibration in your hands and in your butt riding on the 250L than you are on some of the dirt bikes that are still on the market. I talked about this bike being forgiving. The Honda engine's got really linear power delivery. So that's the kind of bike that I can take a new rider, or if just I want to go out and adventure touring, it's nice to have that confidence knowing that I've got predictable power to the ground. Lastly, the 250L is affordable. At about $5,200, this bike is tied for the cheapest bike in its class with the XT250. And this is the more modern bike with the upside down suspension and so on. So now let's talk about cons to the 250L as a dirt bike. Tanner over at the Attention Deficit channel calls this the Too Fatty, and I think that's an apt name for the bike. At 320 pounds, the CRF250L is the heaviest bike in its class. So that low seat height that I was talking about a few minutes ago comes at a cost. The 250L only has 10 inches of ground clearance, which is a dual sport is fine, but when you start looking at dedicated dirt bikes, I'm the guy that has to have the extra finesse to cross those logs and obstacles when we're out on the trail, when all my buddies wearing orange don't have to struggle at all. So after weight, the 250L suspension is probably its greatest weakness. This bike has to pull double duty. So basically, it's not gonna be the greatest on the street and it's not gonna be the greatest on the dirt. If you're just out exploring the trails, the suspension on this bike is great. If you're the kind of person that wants to ride this bike hard or even race, you're going to find the limitations of the suspension and get frustrated. Lastly, the power delivery on this bike is great, but with stock gearing, it's really stubborn to pick up the front wheel. Ultimately, I changed the front sprocket from a 14 tooth down to a 13 tooth, and the rear sprocket from a 40 tooth up to a 42 tooth. That way that this bike will start lofting the front wheel when I need it to get over those obstacles. But the downside to that is still that now max speed on this bike is probably around 65 miles an hour. It's maybe a 10-minute process for me to switch out the front sprocket, but that's still one more compromise that I have to make. So let's talk about living with the CRF250L. I wish this bike had a little bit more gas. I wish this engine was a little more comfortable riding for longer distance on the highway. I wish this bike would loft the front wheel with a little less effort. I absolutely wish this bike was 20 to 30 pounds lighter. I wish the suspension was a little higher spec. But the truth is that if you're looking at a bike that does all the things that I just suggested, there's no way that you're gonna find a bike for that for like $5,000 new. I'm currently doing some light shopping for a dedicated dirt bike. I've decided that I like racing, and as long as my body can put up with it, I think I need to buy a two-stroke because I like doing the technical woods riding. This bike is never going to be that bike. So what's the future with me and the 250L? Ultimately, I think that this bike will be tough for me to replace. I mean, a WR250 would probably be a better bike for a little bit more money. The WR is still 290 some pounds, making it almost 40 pounds heavier than every other bike I would be racing against. And it still has me thinking, if I have a dedicated dirt bike in the shed, is it worth the headache and the money to try to trade the 250L for something else? Long term, I could see maybe trading the 250L for a 690 Enduro, but the price delta between those two bikes is pretty high right now. And by the time I get around to doing that, my mind may have changed completely. Ultimately, despite wanting a better dirt bike, the 250L has done everything I've asked it to do. It's not a race bike. It's not a dedicated street bike, so it does a little bit of everything. Any issues that I had with riding this bike off-road have purely been my lack of skill and my lack of conditioning. I mean, similar to the Scrambler. I love the flexibility of this bike. I like the ability to jump on this bike and just go cruise around the streets with some friends because I want to ride a light bike today. I've taken this thing to the office multiple times, and in the end, it's raced. I mean, this is a bike that no one would ever dream of taking on a track, but that's the only bike I had, so we raced. I also really like the fact that I'll gladly hand the keys to anybody and show them how to ride a motorcycle for the first time. This bike is perfect for that, dirt or street. Even if I buy a dedicated dirt bike, I can't deny the convenience of being able to throw one of my buddies on this bike that doesn't have a 250 for that kind of riding. In the end, the CRF250L is the kind of bike that can take you on a 500-mile all-day ride. You can go ride virtually any trail that you've got the gumption to go tackle, and then it'll also bring you home. That's pretty hard to say for a lot of motorcycles, and especially at that price. There's no denying that I want a higher performance bike because I'm getting into racing, but in the end, unless I find an amazing bike for a killer deal and trade, the 250L is probably here to stay. As usual, if you liked the video, make sure you hit the like button at the bottom of the screen and be sure to subscribe. And more than anything else, I want to hear your comments. If you've got a 250L, why don't you leave a comment below? If this video has helped you at all in any way, let me know.